Your engine has a part in it that costs $16. 16. You can hold all four of them in one hand, and if you ignore them long enough, they will destroy a part that costs $2,500 to replace. That is not an exaggeration. That is not a scare tactic. That is what happens every single day to people who don't know any better. The part I'm talking about is smaller than your pinky finger. It sits inside your engine, buried under a rubber boot, and most people have never seen one in their life. They don't think about it, they don't check it, and they definitely don't change it themselves because their dealer told them it's part of a $500 tune-up package that only a certified technician should perform. That's a lie. The part costs $16 for a set of four. Changing them takes 30 minutes with two basic tools. And if you do it yourself just once, you will never pay a dealer $500 for a tune-up again because you'll realize that 90% of what they're charging you for is stuff that either costs nothing or you already did in a previous visit. But here's the part that should make you angry. Your dealer knows that when this $16 part wears out, it sends raw fuel into your exhaust system and destroys your catalytic converter, a converter that costs $800 to $2,500. They know this. And instead of telling you to spend $16 at AutoZone, they wait until the damage is done and sell you the whole package. Every time your engine runs, there's a tiny explosion happening inside each cylinder. Fuel and air get compressed into a space smaller than your fist. And at exactly the right moment, a spark plug fires a bolt of electricity across a gap thinner than a credit card. That spark ignites the mixture. The explosion pushes the piston down, and that's what makes your car move. Every single cylinder, every single revolution. At highway speed, each spark plug is firing around 1,500 times per minute. That's 90,000 sparks an hour. Now think about what that does to a piece of metal over time. The two electrodes on a spark plug, the center one and the ground one, are taking the full force of that electrical arc every single time they fire. Slowly, microscopically, they erode. The gap between them gets wider, and as that gap opens up, the spark has to jump a longer distance, which means it gets weaker. A weaker spark means the fuel and air mixture doesn't ignite as completely as it should. Some of that fuel goes unburned. You won't feel it at first. It happens so gradually that most people never notice. Your car still starts, still drives, still gets you to work. But your fuel economy drops a little. Your acceleration gets a little softer. Your idle gets a little rougher. You might notice the engine hesitates for a split second when you merge onto the highway, or the car feels like it's working harder, going up a hill that never used to be a problem. On turbocharged engines like the Ford EcoBoost or the Chevy 1.4 turbo, worn plugs are even more noticeable because the turbo is pushing compressed air into the cylinder and expecting a strong, precise spark to ignite a denser fuel mixture. When the spark is weak, the turbo is doing its job, but the ignition can't keep up, and you feel it as a flat spot in the power band right when you need it most. Over 12 months, you might burn an extra $100 or $200 in gas and never connect it to a $3 part sitting inside your engine. And the real problem isn't the wasted fuel or the sluggish performance. It's where that unburned fuel goes after it leaves the cylinder. It doesn't just vanish. It gets pushed out through the exhaust valve, down the exhaust pipe, and straight into the most expensive emissions component on your entire vehicle. And once it gets there, the damage it causes is going to make that $100 in wasted gas look like pocket change. Your catalytic converter sits in the exhaust system, and its job is to burn off harmful emissions before they leave the tailpipe. It operates at extremely high temperatures, around 1200 to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit under normal conditions. It's designed to handle exhaust gases. What it is not designed to handle is raw, unburned fuel. When your spark plugs are worn and the combustion in your cylinders is incomplete, that unburned fuel gets pushed into the exhaust and lands directly on the catalytic converter's ceramic honeycomb. That fuel ignites on contact with the superheated surface, and the temperature inside the converter spikes above 2000 degrees. The ceramic honeycomb starts to melt. Once it melts, it clogs the exhaust flow like a blocked drain. Your engine can't breathe, it loses power, fuel economy tanks, and eventually it can stall completely. Replacing a catalytic converter costs anywhere from $800 to $2,500 depending on your vehicle. On some newer sport utility vehicles with multiple converters, you are looking at $3,000 or more. But the catalytic converter isn't the only thing that suffers. Your ignition coils sit on top of each spark plug, and they're responsible for generating the high voltage that creates the spark. When a spark plug is worn and the gap is too wide, the coil has to push harder to generate enough voltage to jump that gap. It's like asking a sprinter to run the same race but with a longer track every time. The coil overheats, the insulation inside breaks down, and eventually it fails. A single ignition coil costs $50 to $100, and your engine has one for every cylinder. On a 4-cylinder, that's $200 to $400 in coils alone, plus labor. On a V6 or V8, you're over $500 easily. On a Toyota Camry 5.6, the rear bank coils sit against the firewall where heat builds up the most, and those are always the first ones to fail when worn plugs force them to overwork. So let's add this up. You ignored a set of spark plugs that cost $16 to $60. Now you need a catalytic converter for $800 to $2,500. New ignition coils for $200 to $400. Labor on top of all of it. You're staring at a repair bill north of $2,000, possibly $3,000, because of a part that costs less than a pizza dinner. And your dealer knows every bit of this. They know what worn spark plugs do to converters and coils. They see it every week. But instead of telling you to pick up a $16 set of plugs at AutoZone and spend 30 minutes in your driveway, they sell you something much, much more expensive. A set of 4 NGK iridium iron or denso iridium power spark plugs costs $32 to $60 at any AutoZone or O'Reilly in this country. These are not cheap knockoffs. NGK and Denso supply spark plugs directly to car manufacturers. These are the same parts that came in your engine when it rolled off the assembly line. Iridium is one of the hardest metals on Earth. The center electrode is just 0.6 millimeters thick, which means the spark is more focused, more precise, and more consistent than a copper plug can ever produce. A set of copper plugs lasts about 30,000 miles before the gap opens up enough to cause problems. Iridium lasts 100,000 miles. You install them once and forget about them for 5 to 7 years of normal driving. One set of iridium outlasts 3 sets of copper, and you only do the job once instead of 3 times. Your dealer charges somewhere between $500 and $800 for what they call a tune-up package. That package includes the spark plugs, $30 to $60 in parts. An air filter, $15, takes 2 minutes to swap with no tools. A fuel system cleaning, which is a $12 bottle of Techron poured into the gas tank. A computerized engine diagnostic, which is a scan that AutoZone does for free in the parking lot. Throttle body cleaning, $8 for a can of cleaner and a rag. That's roughly $70 in parts and 45 minutes of a technician's time, packaged under a name like Premium Engine Tune-Up, and sold to you for 8 times what it's worth. I had a neighbor bring me a dealer quote last year. $760 for a 60,000-mile tune-up on his Honda CR-V. I went through it with him line by line. The only thing his car actually needed was spark plugs. Everything else was either unnecessary or something he had already done 6 months earlier. He bought a set of NGK iridium plugs for $44, changed them in his driveway in 35 minutes, and kept $700 in his pocket. And the worst part is the dealer knows exactly what happens when you skip the plugs. They know about the catalytic converter damage. They know about the ignition coils burning out. They see it every single week. But selling you a $16 set of plugs makes them nothing. Selling you a $700 package, or better yet, waiting until the converter fails and selling you a $2,500 repair, that's where the money is. The engine needs to be completely cold before you touch a spark plug. Aluminum expands when it's hot, and the threads in a hot cylinder head are tighter than they should be. Pulling a spark plug out of a hot aluminum head can strip those threads, and a $30 job can become a $500 cylinder head repair. Cold engine every time. The spark plug socket is different from a regular socket because it has a rubber insert inside that grips the plug and keeps it from falling into the engine well. Without that rubber insert, you drop the plug, it lands on the electrode, and now you've closed the gap before you even installed it. A plug with a damaged gap misfires immediately. The socket costs about $4, and you'll use it for the rest of your life. Anti-seize. Compound is the part that confuses people because they don't know where it goes. It goes on the threads of the spark plug, a thin layer, and its job is to prevent the plug from seizing to the aluminum head over the next 100,000 miles of heat cycles. Without it, the next time you or a mechanic tries to remove that plug, it can snap off inside the head. That's the nightmare scenario, especially on certain engines. The anti-seize never touches the electrode or the tip, only the threads. Dielectric grease goes in a completely different place. It goes inside the rubber boot of the ignition coil, not on the spark plug itself. It seals the boot from moisture and makes the coil easier to pull off next time. Without it, the boot bonds to the ceramic insulator over time, and you end up ripping the boot trying to get it off, which means a new coil for $50 to $100. Torque is the part most people either ignore or get wrong. Over-tightening a spark plug cracks the ceramic insulator, which kills the plug instantly and can leave pieces of ceramic inside your cylinder. Under-tightening leaves a gap in the seal where combustion gases escape past the threads, which causes a misfire and can burn the threads in the head. A torque wrench set to the manufacturer's spec, usually 12 to 20 foot-pounds for a standard 14mm plug, takes 5 seconds per plug and eliminates both problems. A decent torque wrench costs $15 to $20 and pays for itself the first time you use it. You do one plug at a time, start to finish, before moving to the next. That way you never mix up the firing order and you never have 2 open cylinders at the same time collecting debris. Most iridium spark plugs come pre-gapped from the factory, and the general rule is to leave them alone. The iridium electrode is so thin and so brittle that trying to adjust the gap with a gapping tool can crack it or bend it, and now you've ruined a $12 plug before it ever made it into the engine. But if you're using copper or platinum plugs, you need to check the gap against your owner's manual spec before every installation. A gap that's too wide means the spark has to jump too far, which causes a weak ignition and misfires. A gap that's too narrow means the spark is too short to ignite the mixture fully, which causes incomplete combustion and wasted fuel. A gap tool costs $2. Not checking it can cost you a catalytic converter. Now, there's one engine I need to talk about specifically, because if you own one, everything I just said about doing this yourself does not apply to you. The Ford 5.4-liter Triton V8, found in F-150s, Expeditions, and Lincoln Navigators from 2004 to 2008. The spark plugs in this engine are a two-piece design that is notorious for breaking off inside the cylinder head when you try to remove them. The tip stays stuck in the head, and getting it out requires a special extraction tool and sometimes hours of labor. A job that should cost $200 turns into a $1,000 to $1,500 repair with a helicoil thread insert. If you have this engine, take it to a shop that specializes in Triton plug removal. That's not cowardice, that's the smartest money you'll spend all year. A set of iridium spark plugs costs $32 to $60. Changing them takes 30 minutes on most four-cylinder engines with a spark plug socket, a ratchet, and a torque wrench. That's it. No lift, no computer, no certification. Your driveway on a Saturday morning. Your dealer wants $500 to $800 for that same job wrapped in a package full of services you don't need. And if you ignore the plugs altogether, you are looking at $800 to $2,500 for a melted catalytic converter, $200 to $400 in burned-out ignition coils, and months of wasted fuel you never noticed because the car still started every morning. A $3,000 lesson in what happens when you let a $16 part go too long. The spark plug is the smallest, cheapest, most overlooked part in your entire engine, and it has more power to destroy expensive components than almost anything else under the hood. A weak spark doesn't just make your car run rough. It sends raw fuel into your exhaust, melts your converter, overworks your coils, and burns through your gas budget one tank at a time. All of that stops the moment you put in a fresh set of plugs. I've been changing spark plugs on my property for 50 years. I've seen engines with 200,000 miles on them running smooth as silk because the owner changed the plugs on schedule. And I've seen engines with 80,000 miles choking on melted converters because nobody ever popped the hood. The difference between those two cars was 30 minutes and $44. Your dealer can keep that $700 tune-up. I've got better things to spend my money on.